Hello, and welcome to the Green Growth Knowledge Platform's webinar on COP21 and beyond, aligning policies for a low-carbon economy. My name is Amanda McKee, and I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Officer with the GGKP. And by way of introduction, I'd like to quickly introduce you to the GGKP and provide some context for this webinar series. The GGKP was founded in 2012 by the Global Green Growth Institute, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Bank. It has since expanded to a global partnership of over 40 leading international organizations, universities, and think tanks. These partners all share a common belief that mobilizing a green economy transition requires that policymakers, practitioners, and experts have access to cutting-edge knowledge and data to support their efforts. And so with this mandate in mind, the GGKP focuses on two sets of activities. The first is really to work with our partner institutions to identify and address major knowledge gaps in green growth theory and practice. And the second is to gather and share green growth knowledge and data with the growing community of practice. As part of these activities, this year the GGKP is hosting a green growth webinar series with thanks to the generous financial support from Germany's GIZ and the Swiss government. Today's webinar is the fourth in our series, and it will focus on the topic of a recent report produced jointly by the OECD, the International Energy Agency, the International Transport Forum, and the Nuclear Energy Agency on the topic of aligning policies for a low-carbon economy. So before I introduce our moderator for today's event, I wanted to quickly highlight a few logistical issues for all participants. First, we strongly encourage you to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing questions into the chat box, which is found on the right-hand side of your webinar screen. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff, who will then repost them to all participants for our panelists to address during the Q&A period. We will also be circulating a survey after the webinar concludes, and I would encourage you to complete it, as this provides us with very valuable feedback to help shape our future webinars in this series. Finally, if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please feel free to email us at contact@ggkp.org. The email address is also on your screen currently, and we will help you to troubleshoot any problems. And so now, without any further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar. Elliot Whittington is the Deputy Director of Policy at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. There he leads a body of work to support business and policy action on climate change. Elliot is also the Deputy Director of the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group, which brings together business to work towards a step change in policy and action on climate change. With over 15 years of experience in working to unlock systemic change, including at Save the Children, Christian Aid, and by mobilizing grassroots campaignings in various locations around the world, we are very fortunate to have Elliot here today to lead this webinar. And so, Elliot, without further ado, I will now turn the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome to everybody. I'm glad to be here. I hope everybody else is. We have obviously in front of us a discussion of a very important topic, the alignment of policies behind a low-carbon transition. And that's something that is very important to me and very important to the work that we do at CISL, Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So I'm very glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers. So today we're going to have three 10-minute presentations from the team behind the report, which I will introduce each of the speakers in a second. And then we obviously have a discussion and a response from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, followed by a 35-minute Q&A. As Amanda asked you, if you have questions, well, and we hope you have questions, please do pose them. So put them in through the chat box, and we'll compile them, and they'll be asked during the Q&A towards the end of the session. So your questions will be fed through then. Also worth noting that the webinar is being recorded, so if you miss bits, whatever, you'll be able to go back and watch the recording. So, I mean, just to move on in terms of focusing on the topic at hand, I think it's a really important thing that, and I'm really glad that we're going to get to hear from the team behind this report, because it's good to see such a solid explication of these issues. Certainly at CISL, we've been working for 25 years educating business leaders and government leaders on sustainability issues. And for the last 10 years, we've also been facilitating business action and business dialogue around them. And I think increasingly we've been aware that certainly if you look at climate change, that there is an initial tendency to interpret climate change through a small number of lenses, so the carbon targets, adaptation targets, carbon pricing, occasionally bits and pieces of energy policy, all incredibly important, and none of which should be put to one side. But even were we to get all the right things in place in those areas, there's a whole we've got the picture up of an iceberg. There's a whole 2/3 of the iceberg left, if you like, which is the wider economy, the wider economic system that you're working with. All of the policies around innovation, around new infrastructure development, around the incentives in the economy, and investment indeed, that need to come into place to rewire the economy in order to be able to deliver on the aspirations of our sustainable economy, a low carbon transition, and tackling some of the goals and objectives that we've been set out through things like the Sustainable Development Goals. At CISL, we've just articulated a framework around this called Rewiring the Economy, but it's great to see how much this theme is being picked up in different places. I think that building on, for example, the work of the New Climate Economy, which set out a very clear choice, that we're seeing more and more this sense that there are choices in the economy, there are things that need to be done, and when you align behind some of the sustainable goals, you end up with win-wins across the board, and so it's really good to see somebody going through this with the thoroughness and credibility that the OECD can bring to it. Obviously, together with the IEA, the International Transport Forum, and the Nuclear Energy Agency of the OECD, that's an incredibly broad spectrum of expertise that we're bringing together. So without further ado, I will shortly shut up, but I will introduce our first three speakers. So we've got, as I said, we've got three presentations on the topic of the report, so setting out the report for you. First, there is Richard Baron, who is in charge of the OECD Roundtable on Sustainable Development. For the last year, he's been project coordinator and co-author of this report. He also was head of climate policy at the IEA, has worked at the French think tank IDRI, has a series of books and publications to his name, and generally brings a whole wealth of expertise. Virginie Marchal from the OECD Environment Directorate is also the co-author of the report. Prior to her position at OECD, she held a position at BP's biofuels team. She's also worked for Total in Latin America and France, so she brings a real international expertise to the table. And finally, Simon Muller is responsible for IEA analysis on renewable electricity policy, including grid and system integration of renewables, which is obviously a key topic right now. And since joining the IEA in 2010, he has authored numerous IEA publications on grid integration, market and policy design, as well as renewable energy technologies. So I will say goodbye for now and hand over to that incredible panel, and then I'll come back when we will to introduce our discussant later.
Thank you, Elliot, and welcome all. It's our pleasure to be able to deliver some of the insights from this work that was undertaken by the four organizations here and delivered, in fact, to our finance, trade, and economy ministers in June this year and published in July. What I will do is first explain why it is worthwhile to look at policy alignment, then give some insights on alignment issues for some broad policy domains. Next, we will cover some key sectors in the transition and then conclude, and Simon Muller here from IEA will provide a deeper account of alignment issues in electricity, in particular with the perspective of renewables. So just to put things in perspective, at the OECD, we believe that the framework is provided by IPCC scenarios, and just to be clear, we're looking at a full net decarbonization of the economy by the second half of the century. That's the premise of this work, and obviously we need to be very effective if we are going to put all the economic actors in this direction. So we need core climate policies for us to get there. We need stable and predictable climate policies that comprise the following: a strong price of carbon where we can, so that the investments become competitive with the carbon-intensive technologies. We also need some very strong regulatory support in areas where the price is not as effective, such as in energy efficiency. And last but not least, we need targeted support for the uptake and development of low-carbon technologies. These are all very necessary, but we believe they're not sufficient. The reality is that climate policy is going to show up on the policy landscape with various shapes or forms, but that it comes on top of existing public policy frameworks, be they in a fiscal environment, economic policy, competition, and others listed here. There is in fact no reason a priori to think that the existing policy frameworks are automatically aligned with climate goals. In many cases, they might inadvertently stop the progress of our climate policy instruments. Secondly, and an illustration thereof, is that for decades, coal, oil, and gas have been used, and they have made their marks on the policy frameworks. And that's why we intended to provide a first diagnosis on what we call misalignments, and we're doing this in this book across various domains. First of all, cross-cutting policy domains, and in this case, we're going to cover tax, innovation and skills, finance and investment, but the book also goes into adaptation and trade and competition. Secondly, we will look at specific activities, starting with mobility and urban planning, land use, and as I said, electricity will come afterwards. So the idea by looking at those misalignments is that if the policymakers in those domains take a closer look and realign some of their policy instruments to allow the climate policy signals to go smoothly, we're going to go towards a more cost-effective and a more ambitious climate action, which is what we strive for. So quickly going through some of the cross-cutting policy domains, let me start with taxes. Taxes and tax expenditures, as we know well here in the OECD, send a multitude of powerful signals to companies and households. Now, the first thing we need to do, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear this from us, is that we need to restore the coherence between the energy-related taxes and the expenditures and the transition to low carbon. First of all, we know and have identified and inventoried a great deal of fossil fuel subsidies that are actual government spending in support of fossil fuel production and uses, and these are incoherent in most cases with the low carbon transition. We're seeing them declining a little bit, but they're still fairly important. Secondly, we're taking a close look at how energy is taxed throughout our economy to see whether those taxes are conducive to the low carbon signal. And let me illustrate this with the following graph. On the x-axis, you have the total CO2 emissions from the OECD countries, and on the y-axis, you have all the taxes that are paid on various fossil fuels throughout the economy. And you see on the left-hand side, transport being fairly heavily taxed. For the rest of it, not much taxes being applied to the tune of 10 euros per ton of CO2 or less. We think that some redressing of that picture would go in the right direction. Now, we also looked at taxes beyond just energy, because there are in fact many tax provisions that affect how households and private sector makes decisions. For instance, we looked at company cars and commuting expenses. There is fiscal treatment in our countries that actually transfer from government coffers to citizens something around 30 billion euros a year. Now, the company cars account for 19% of the global fleet of OECD countries, and they turn out to be systematically more CO2 intensive, bigger cars, and driven more. So these are 30 billion euros that our countries are spending to encourage more CO2 emissions, another form of subsidy which is not captured in the other work. We've also looked at property and land taxes, various incentives that exist for home ownership, and we find in many cases, but not all, that those taxes tend to encourage urban sprawl, and that by a fine-tuning of the design of those taxes, we might actually redress that situation as well. But for now, there are situations where urban sprawl, more commuting, more energy use is actually encouraged and not discouraged by the design of those instruments. And we also looked at corporate and income tax provisions. This is more preliminary, but we do find in some cases that some of the tax loopholes that exist tend to be used more by heavy industry, and it's worthwhile to look further into those. Last but not least, we advise our countries to look at how, if we manage to move away from fossil fuel use, which are still taxed, and bring in money for the budget, we should probably anticipate tax reform to accommodate those changes, as they're likely to be structural. Turning now briefly to innovation and skills for the transition, we all recognize we need more innovation to bring the low greenhouse gas technologies and practices to market, and also to allow new dynamic firms to emerge, because the incumbents are the reason why we are where we are now with a fairly carbon-intensive economy. We've looked, first of all, at a macro signal, if you will, with public RD&D expenditures, and find that they fall short of the low-carbon energy transition challenge. Illustration of this, look at the blue line that starts from a peak in 1980 and has been going down. This is the share of energy in public expenditures in RD&D. It's actually moving down when, in fact, energy and climate issues have moved up on the political discourse. I think there is here an incoherence that we need to correct as well, and that can be done. Second, we also looked at innovation incentives, and we find that there are a set of general policy instruments in the economic environment that are not always conducive to the most innovating firms to come in, and in particular, they might create some barriers for the entrance of challengers to the incumbents. This is an example of that. On the left-hand side, you have countries, and this indicates actually the tax subsidy rates on RD&D in the private sector. On the left-hand side, you have a set of countries who are pretty effective in mobilizing RD&D through tax benefits, if you will. On the right-hand side, however, you have a set of countries for which the design of those incentives don't allow loss-making companies to access that kind of support. And in fact, this is to the detriment of small and new companies most of the times, because it usually takes a while for those companies to start making a profit, and we argue strongly that they should have access so that they're going to be allowed to bring in their technological innovations to the market. Some of our countries have policy designs that don't allow that to happen. Last, we also looked at the governance of the demand-side innovation, think standards that are applied to appliances, to cars and the like, and we find that there might be some improvements there, provided that maybe governments can work together across the board to do this in a more internationally coordinated fashion. In addition, government procurement policies are in fact very important in driving the economy. They account between 13 and 16% of GDP. And not all of these procurement policies are in fact coherent with the low carbon transition, and we need to better align in this area as well. Last but not least, there are in some cases significant skill gaps between what a policy intends to deliver, and I'm thinking in some cases for the deep renovation of buildings, for instance, and the workforce that is there to deliver on this policy signal. We have found cases where in fact the workforce is not in fact in a position to actually conduct the sort of changes that the policy requires, but we've also seen some countries who've put in place some pretty effective skills, competency improvements program to make that happen. So that's it for my part. I will now give the floor to Virginie Marchal to present further insights from this work.
Many thanks, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me turn now to the investment and finance challenge. We know that the challenge of investment for a low-carbon economy is twofold. On one hand, we need to scale up investment. Even if we don't consider climate change, if we don't have climate change considerations, actually there's an investment gap to support development goals in our economy and to support infrastructure needed for economic development. The New Climate Economy estimates that the gap is around $90 trillion by 2030. The IEA did some research on the energy side of those infrastructure, and they estimate that $53 trillion are needed by 2035 in order to support a low-carbon economy and to support energy needs. This is slightly more expensive than in a business-as-usual scenario without thinking about a 2-degree target, but not much more expensive. It's 10% more expensive. The second issue regarding investment is about shifting. The issue today is that not only we don't have enough investment in long-term infrastructure, but actually the allocation of capital is going in the wrong direction for a low-carbon economy. Today, 2/3 of global investment in energy supply still goes to fossil fuels. We have a graph showing this trend. So yes, there's been some tremendous progress in investment in renewable energy. We started around 45 billion in 2004, and now in 2014 we're around 270 billion. So it's a tremendous growth and it's important. But if we look at the share that renewable energy investments represent compared to other assets, well, we're still locking ourselves in a carbon-intensive development and pathways. So what should we do in order to address this challenge, and what are the barriers that are preventing us from allocating this capital to the appropriate types of infrastructure? Well, first of all, we need to channel all the sources of finance towards low carbon infrastructure, public and private. We're not lacking any finance. There hasn't been as much money in the economy as today. There are around 300 trillion assets in the financial sectors in the hands of institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, public banks, and traditional commercial banks. But we need to redirect this money in the right type of infrastructure. First of all, private finance. Of course, private finance will cover most of those investments, but we need to send the right signal in the economy to drive those investments. The first point is to develop a green investment policy framework that is conducive to low carbon investment. And this is about having the proper climate policies that are stable, long-term. Richard mentioned it at the beginning of the presentation, to have a price on carbon, but also to implement proper investment policies, such as implementing rule of law in countries. I'm not going to dive into this because most of this presentation is actually about getting this green investment policy framework right. But we had a closer look at actually other factors that may influence this misallocation of capital. And the second one is actually the rules that are governing the financial sector. And here we're thinking about particularly prudential regulations. They've been implemented in order to secure the financial market and to have really financial security, and this is a precondition to have investment. If you don't have investment in assets, you no longer have any investment in low carbon. But actually, what we are finding, and many other organizations as well, is that those regulations, as they are calibrated today, Basel III or Solvency II, may have unintended consequences on the ability of traditional investors, such as commercial banks, to really go in a long-term direction and to give long-term loans. So we're urging governments to identify the consequences of those regulations, and without saying to reform them, but actually to implement maybe complementary financial tools and instruments that may correct those kind of unintended consequences in the financial sector. Then for private finance, we also we realized that there's an issue in terms of the valuation of climate risk and liabilities in our economy today. It's not taken into account when investors are making their decision on allocation of capital. And it's a big financial liability that is not considered in the risk-return profile of assets and investments. For instance, the IE estimates again that 300 billion of assets could be stranded by 2050 if we go into a 2-degree pathway. It means that oil reserves and gas reserves should stay in the ground. It means that we should put some coal plants or energy plants early in retirement because we need to switch to other low carbon alternatives and lower carbon alternatives. This is a big risk in the economy, and it means that there's a need for investors to really disclose and value this climate risk that is linked to climate policies, and to value those liabilities if we want a stable economy and if we really want to move towards low carbon. Last but not least, public finance is going to be really important if you want to achieve those objectives. And here again, we identified a few inconsistencies in the way governments are allocating their money and their finances. For instance, Richard mentioned a bit earlier the public procurement issues that represent 13% of GDP, and it's a third of government expenditure in OECD countries. So it's a very powerful leverage if we want to influence behaviors and influence investors. However, today, even if 80% of the country are considering and realizing that this tool is powerful for green growth and green development, there's only 16% of the countries in the OECD that implement full life cycle analysis for their projects. So it means that it's not taken into account today. In terms of public finance, there's also the issue of official development assistance and the consistency between domestic objectives and international behaviors. Today, there have been some really good progress in terms of incorporating climate goals in development assistance, from 4% around 2000 to 2004 to 16% of official development aid in 2011-2013. But it still means that there are more than 80% of official development that is not directly taking into account climate in their considerations. There are still too many support to carbon-intensive assets in the development policies. So we encourage government to really take a close look at those things. I'm now going to consider two specific sectors that we looked at. It's urban mobility and agriculture. Actually, it's at the sectoral level that we see how those different misalignments in the sectors and in the policies are interacting and are creating the right or the wrong incentive to go to low carbon. So first of all, we looked at the urban mobility. Why did we look at urban mobility? Well, it's a significant share of emissions, and it's one of the sectors where governments are struggling to really find efficient and implement efficient policies to go to zero net emission by the end of the century. And why is that? It's because current transport systems are really wired into fossil fuel-based individual cars, passenger cars, and this comes with a high environmental costs. Well, we talk about climate change, but it comes as well with a really high health cost. So the challenge here is really how we can shift away from individual cars to mass transport modes, reduce the need for travel, and improve fuel and vehicle efficiency. We're going to need all those three policies if we want to achieve our objective in urban mobility, in decarbonizing urban mobility. It's just the graduation and the importance of each policy will be different depending of the city context. If we look at OECD cities, most of them have already their infrastructure bases, and it's going to be maybe more difficult to implement policies that will reduce the need to travel, but we need to move really strongly into innovation and low carbon vehicles. If we think about developing economies, well, here there's an opportunity to shape today the appropriate infrastructure base to reduce transport and reduce their carbon footprints. We identified three types of misalignment for achieving those goals and implementing those policies. The first one is linked to governance. It seems to be obvious, but there's a need to integrate land use planning and transport policies at the urban level in order to achieve those goals. The International Transport Forum ran some modeling exercise, and they discovered that we could reduce between 25% and 40% of CO2 emissions at the city level in Latin America, China, and India if we implement transit-oriented types of development and urban development. So it's really an important aspect to take into account. How to do that? Well, there's a need to adopt a co-benefit approach to transport, and it's not done enough. I was talking about the cost of health linked to traditional types of transport, diesel cars, just to mention a type of technology that might have a huge cost, and it's around $3.5 trillion per year in OECD countries plus China plus India, the health cost linked to air pollution, linked to transport. Then second, there's a need to integrate national and subnational actions to improve coherence between the policies at the national level and the subnational level. And then third, overcome government fragmentation at the local level. One of the issues we face to implement those policies is that there's often a mismatch between the administrative boundaries of the cities and the functional boundaries of the cities. We have the example of Paris here, where la Ville de Paris is a really small, actually, unit when the transport that is happening around the city is much broader than just this administrative boundary. It doesn't mean that it's a bad example, because Paris and France implemented really innovative types of policies and collaboration, governance arrangement that allow all stakeholders and all municipalities around Paris to coordinate their policies toward transport. So in the book we're providing many examples of how those misalignment could be overcome through institutional arrangements. The second type of barrier for sustainable mobility is linked to finance. And more importantly, to what national government policies, what type of signal they are sending to local governments. We need to empower cities because they are in the best position to really implement the policies that are needed. But there are still some barriers to their action. An obvious one is actually what is happening in China, where subnational governments budget rely mainly on selling land in order to secure their budget, so it's a direct incentive to sprawl, and it's in contradiction with objectives of reducing travel needs within the boundaries of the cities. Last but not least, it's about innovation. I mean, I was talking about those societies that are wired around individual cars. We have a lot of inertia in the infrastructure today because mostly it's based on this individual car and fossil fuels. So it's really important that actually countries remove bottlenecks to energy efficiency and technology breakthrough, and this requires approaches that are on the demand side and on the supply side. There are countries that have been quite innovative to this regard, in the Netherlands and in Norway, for instance, and they provide interesting examples of what can be done to remove those bottlenecks. So I'm moving now to sustainable land use and how to strengthen incentives for sustainable land use. So why land use, again, is an interesting sector to look at? Well, because today land use contributes to 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and in most scenarios we are considering that land use should be a net carbon sink by the end of the century if we want to achieve a 2-degree target. And at the same time, there are some FAO projections that are saying that we need 60% more food produced by land in order to cover cover growing population needs and food. So it's quite a challenge, and we identified again 4 types of misalignments here that are preventing this to happen. The first one is around the use of agricultural support policies and incentives. If we look at what happened in OECD countries in the last 20 years, well, there have been some progress again. If we look at the most environmentally harmful type of support, which is support that is directly related to the use of fertilizers or to the production of farmers, it went down from 85% of the total subsidies to 50% of the subsidies in 2012. So it's a huge progress, but there's still 50% of subsidies to agriculture that are encouraging more input use and hence creating more potential for greenhouse gas emissions. So it's something to really look at, and if we consider emerging economies and emerging countries, those practices are more and more important as well. So governments need to take a close look at that. Then we looked at trade measures. Again, the theory is saying that in order to optimize mitigation, adaptation, and food security, you need to remove barriers to trade. And here we are encouraging governments to look at what are their subsidies and trade and tariffs on trade for agriculture goods in order to go to low carbon. I'm not saying that it's easy, because there are some consequences, social consequences, that need to be taken into account, but at least governments need to understand what are the consequences of their policies. The third type of misalignment is linked actually to our ability to adapt to climate change. There are still many countries that are providing insurance subsidies for crops to support agriculture's resilience. And it's a way to disconnect farmers from the reality of climate change and from adapting to a changing climate. And it's quite worrisome when we know that yields could be reduced by up to 25% under a changing climate in the future. Then Another one is about the value of services provided by forests and ecosystem that are not enough taken into account when it comes to decision in terms of land allocation and land use. There are some really interesting examples here, such as the mechanism developed for forests, RED, but it's something that government needs to improve and to extend to other sectors. Then last but not least, we covered food waste. The FAO estimates that up to 30% of food production is wasted between the field and between the fork. We discovered that there's a lot of uncertainty actually on where and when this waste is happening, and we encourage government to do a kind of audit of their own policies in agriculture policies, health policies, food policies, and economic policies to see if there are not some contradictory signals that are sent, such as signals on food regulation and legislations. To conclude on those issues, I mean, the challenge could seem to be daunting. We just exposed more than 20 or even 30 misalignments. Well, it's not that daunting, because if each government is taking this approach at the national level, they might identify just 3, 4, or 5 misalignments that will help them make the difference in terms of being more ambitious towards climate goal and managing to be to implement climate policies that are less costly. But what is needed here is that actually they need to take a whole of government approach to climate change. Climate change is no longer in the hands of environment ministers. It has to be in the hands of the whole government and all the ministers around the table, and that each of them looks in their courtyard to see if they're not sending contradictory signals to a low carbon objective. And it's not that challenging either, because resolving those misalignments can actually foster sustainable development and inclusive growth. There are some trade-offs sometimes between economic and social objectives and climate policies, but most of the time the reform we are proposing are actually can really have co-benefits on other development types of development, such as more progressive taxes or even energy-related policies can create more energy security, improve local air pollution, better mobility. So it's really about co-benefits, and it's important to take the full picture of the reform that are needed. Last but not least, what about COP21 and what about an agreement at the international level? Here we identified misalignments in domestic settings, but actually in the absence of such an agreement in 2015, there might be raising numbers of misalignment at the international level, coming from a lack of ambition, common ambition around the world. So we're urging governments to really take this approach and encourage cooperation between themselves so that we're efficient in the domestic setting. Thank you. I now pass it to Simon to talk a bit more in details about the energy sector and electricity.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from depending on where you're joining this webinar. It's my pleasure to add to the challenges and misalignments that were already presented from the previous speakers, this time focusing very much on the electricity sector. Why focus on electricity? Well, electricity is crucial in order to address decarbonization successfully. Key low-carbon technologies that are commercially available today, in particular for renewable energy, are electricity technologies. So, for example, solar PV and wind energy. If you look at some of the long-term scenarios that we're doing at the IEA on this slide, you see that the difference between an unsustainable scenario, which taken here from the Energy Technology Perspectives publication, is the 6-degree Celsius scenario, and a more sustainable 2-degree scenario. The difference between these scenarios comes from a multitude of sources, first of which is energy efficiency, but directly afterwards we see the role of renewables. So both electricity and renewables are a key to successfully decarbonizing our economies. However, as you won't be surprised to hear, there are a number of issues in the electricity sector to actually streamline decarbonization into the system. I could be speaking about numerous challenges here. One has to do with electricity taxation that might keep out options that increase overall system efficiency and therefore catalyze decarbonization. Think of heat pumps, which are hindered because we have high taxation on electricity. However, one point that I wanted to focus on specifically is the question of electricity market design. So if we look at how we organize the wholesale markets for electricity, we need to take a step back and look at how this regulatory system, how this system of arrangements for trade of electricity has developed. Up until starting from the middle of the 20th century, we had the dominant paradigm of the electricity sector being vertically integrated monopolies that were then increasingly liberalized with the introduction of wholesale competition. The country that pioneered this in the 1980s was Chile, and in particular in the 1990s, a number of OECD countries followed suit and introduced wholesale competition. The primary objective of this move towards liberalized markets was to reduce what was perceived as excess capacity coming from the vertically integrated times and increase the overall system efficiency. However, the market design that was chosen critically depended or was tailored to technologies that were available at that time. Most importantly, a new technology that entered the market at scale in the 1990s, which is combined cycle gas turbines. These are characterized by fairly low capital expenditures, so they're fairly cheap to build, and fairly high operating expenditures, so very high fuel costs. Or let's say fuel costs take up a higher share in overall electricity costs. Also, this market design hinges on the flexibility of fossil fuels that they can be called upon to generate at the convenience of market participants. On the next slide, we see the basic principle how price formation in these markets functions. What we see is, on the one hand, the supply curve illustrated with different types of technologies. In the electricity sector, this is called the merit order curve. And then we see the almost vertical line representing electricity demand. The point where those two intersect is the point where we form the price, and we see this is just about below 80 US dollars per megawatt hour. It is primarily the fuel costs, so the short-run costs of the technology, that drive this price. And in a system based on fossil fuels, this makes sense, depending on how much demand we actually have in the system. If we're using cheaper fuels to produce electricity, the price will fall accordingly. And most importantly, this incentivizes fuel efficiency. If I have lower operating costs, I'm more likely to be called upon to generate. And also, what you see here, the difference between, I hope you can see the mouse, the difference between the actual price line and the short-run cost provides what is called inframarginal rents. These are used to recover the capital costs of power plants. Now, when we look at the cost structure of electricity generation, I've mentioned previously that fossil generation is characterized by low capex, high opex. But if we look further into the future, what does the cost structure of a decarbonized system in electricity actually look like? We find it is radically different. On the top of this slide, you see the long-run costs of different generation technologies, again expressed in US dollars per megawatt hour. If we compare this to the short-run costs, we see that the fuel costs of these technologies become negligible compared to the very high capital costs or the proportionately higher capital costs of these technologies. Now, this has important implications for the design of electricity markets. As you will see in the report, concluding current designs of wholesale electricity markets in many OECD countries are not strategically aligned with the
Hi. Well, apologies for the slight technical hitch we seem to have had with the OECD, and that was a particularly interesting point in Simon's presentation, so that's unfortunate. But we will take this moment to go over to Rasmus Valenko from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which I'm well aware of because we work closely with them through partnerships like We Mean Business. But I'm particularly pleased to hear from Rasmus because he has both 7 years experience from working for Shell, so in the private sector in the energy space, but also has worked for the Ministries of Energy and Foreign Affairs for the government of Finland. So he's seen both the government and the private sector sides of this problem and has considerable experience. So over to you, Rasmus, to tell us your thoughts on the presentations you've managed to see and on the report. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Elliot. So yeah, it was a shame that we missed Elliot's end of his presentation, because it just really goes to show that the design of any markets and all the policies that are related to it are not obvious to make the right choices today, given that we actually don't really know what technologies we have in store for tomorrow. And that's also an area that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is working a lot on. Just very briefly, for those of you who don't know what the WBCSD is, we're essentially a group of companies, about 200 multinational companies, that work together on sustainable development, all the different issues, be it climate, water, social issues, etc. And what we try to do is to bring groups of companies, be it a value chain or a sector or topics where different sectors can interact and learn from each other, to find innovative solutions. And in my case, it's around the energy and climate change space. So we've launched something called the Lowcarbon Technology Partnerships Initiative, which maybe after this webinar you can look up to see how the private sector is taking action. That goes a little bit to answering Peter Rowan's question that he posted in the chat earlier already. So where do I want to start? I want to start first by congratulating the hosts and the presenters on the great piece of work that they've done. Some of you might be forgiven for thinking that it's a very daunting challenge that we have in front of us if we want to align all policies for a low-carbon society in the future. And it is a daunting task, but I think we've taken the first step now, in the sense that we've identified now some of the key policies that support climate objectives. And I think for that reason, I would applaud the work that the OECD has done together with ITF, OECD, etc. So what I'd like to do is give a short private sector comment really on this report. And with that in mind, the first thing I would say is that the private sector sees these issues. And traditionally, I think the way that people look at the private sector is that you have interests or interested parties. So you might have, let's say, trade associations which push only their technologies. And what we're seeing in the World Business Council now is really a change from moving from, let's say, a very siloed view of what needs to happen in terms of policies to more of a collaborative approach, realizing that the policies need to be technology neutral. As Simon's last point there around, we do not want to pick winners today in terms of the technologies. What we want to give them is specific sustainability goals and criteria that then those different technologies can compete with. I wanted to pick up 3 points really that come out of the report and the discussion. So the first point is around the detailed regulations that are in place. So what we've seen from the report is that there's key issues like carbon pricing or fossil fuel subsidies, which of course need to change or be implemented. But what it comes down to is when you're a company, you're trying to get a project off the ground that actually helps to mitigate climate change or build resilience or something else, is that sometimes the devil is in the detail. So for example, if we take a technology like carbon capture and storage, so that's a technology that wholly relies on the fact that we want to do something about climate change, because it has absolutely no purpose other than to put CO2, store it safely underground for millennia. Now, you would think that it's almost a given that a carbon pricing or emissions trading scheme, etc., was going to help that. But what we noticed in the European Union, for example, was when there were some support policies to spur innovation and help with the upfront capital cost of those projects, was that one of the key issues was actually around the long-term liability. So with carbon capture and storage, the idea is that you capture CO2, transport it, and store it under the ground. Now the big question for the companies who, arguably have a lot of firepower, like Shell, in terms of financial resources, was that it was very difficult for them to commit to those projects simply because they had open-ended liability. So what companies wanted was certainty in terms of when is it that those companies can hand over the liability for the storage site to the government. Is it 10 years? Is it 15 years? Is it 50 years? And what needs to happen to be able to hand over that liability? So a question like that in terms of, what is the liability in terms of when can you hand it over, but then also what's the size? So what are you actually liable for in terms of scenarios that could take place with those storage sites? Another good example of that is really energy efficiency. So that's another area which we're working on in the WBCSD. Energy efficiency in buildings is a program that's looked at, what are some of the barriers to deploying energy efficiency. Again, conventional wisdom says that, there should be a very quick payback in terms of the investments you make in energy efficiency. So why is this not happening in buildings? Well, it comes down again to the specific, details of the situation. So often what you find is that the people who need to make the investments in energy efficiency improvements aren't necessarily the ones who reap the benefits. So take the classic example of an owner of an apartment building, let's say, and the owner would make an investment into the capital to make the building more efficient, but actually the benefit accrues to the person who pays the bills, who is actually the person renting the apartments. So again, the question is, how do you get those incentives aligned? And you need to go to the detailed regulations, look at maybe things like, building codes and standards, and also then shared rewards and benefits to the different stakeholder groups. So the detailed regulation, even though it seems quite administrative, it's only when really, real projects try to implement, they find these detailed regulations, and they can bring them up with the regulators to have a conversation about what's the best way to go through this. The second point I want to make is really the complexity of the climate challenge. I think it was really, Richard's one of his first slides that showed, that climate change is an issue that spans all the other policy issues. And, it's cross-country, cross-cutting with lots of linkages. A classic example we've seen really in the energy space, again, if I focus on Europe, is, we have the emissions trading scheme. So in the emissions trading scheme, the idea is that everybody under the cap has to reduce their emissions, and if they go over that cap, they have to relinquish credits for the emissions. And the whole system works through a market mechanism, so you try to balance supply with demand. So if there's a high demand for credits, in terms of lots of people emitting, then the price of those credits goes up. Now there's another conversation in Europe about energy efficiency, so if we link it to the previous topic. So in Europe there's a belief that maybe the ETS isn't going far enough in terms of changing the economy. So there's a big debate on, well, should there be energy efficiency targets on top of the emissions trading scheme for the same sectors? Well, now, if you look at how do you harmonize those two, so if you create, an obligation or a mandate for certain amounts of energy efficiency, essentially what you're doing is you're taking out the demand from the ETS market for the carbon credits. So that depresses the price of the CO2 credits, and then undermines in some ways the ETS. I think the jury's still out if that's actually a real threat. But it just goes to show that even within the climate space, you have policies which need to be aligned as well. One more on terms of just the complexity of the problem. If we pick up on Virginie's point around mobility and transport. So mobility and transport is really hardwired into fossil fuels, just in terms of our history. And what we've noticed is that you need several different policies to actually make changes happen. You need to have already policies in terms of trying to get the fuel suppliers to provide cleaner fuels into the market. So for example, through biofuels mandates. and then going past that from first generation to the second and third generation in terms of improved greenhouse gas performance and sustainability. Then you also need to have regulations on the vehicle manufacturers so that they manufacture vehicles that have less emissions. And then finally, you can also have regulations and policies that target the consumer. So in terms of carbon tax added to the fuels. But life isn't that simple. If we take the last piece of that puzzle, for example, around the carbon tax on consumers. If you look at the carbon tax on consumers for petrol and diesel in France, what you find is that it's a great policy, but there's so many loopholes that I wonder how effective it's going to be. And the loopholes are classic ones where you need to harmonize with other policy considerations. So for example, taxi drivers, they're exempt, or farmers, they're exempt. And that goes to show that there's other policies that the governments need to take into consideration and other objectives that they need to take into consideration. In the WBCSD, we have a project called Sustainable Mobility. And in that project, these companies and WBCSD have been going to different cities around the world to try to understand what are the drivers of change in these different cities. And what we've done is we've pulled together a list of different types of indicators that we can map out in terms of how well these cities are doing on different sustainability criteria. And when we have the first conversations with these cities, actually more often than not, greenhouse gases aren't top of their list. There's things like livability of the city, or let's say local air pollutants, like we were talking about the diesel fumes, for example. Or we're talking about access to transportation even, and zonal planning, noise, etc. And it just goes to show how complex these issues really are. The good news is, of course, that there's often win-win situations. So for example, if you're looking at an urban city center and you're implementing electric vehicles, let's say, then you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions as long as you have also a plan to decarbonize the electricity that's provided. But that also helps to reduce noise, improves the livability of that city, improves the air quality. And then going back to another question that came in through the chat, I thought there's a great example in Milan, for example, where they made the case for implementing electric vehicles and a network of charging points to the city by incorporating data on other sustainability criteria. And those sustainability criteria, interestingly enough, were around health, as well as simply the costs that they currently incur in cleaning and keeping up the different monuments and building facades annually. So it's a very complex issue, and it's not going to be easy. But then to my third point, which is almost, I'd say, our conclusion. In the WBCSD, we focus a lot on collaboration. And we've seen that, that great things can happen when sectors collaborate, which are quite like-minded often. But what we're starting to see is a trend of companies and sectors wanting to collaborate beyond their own, let's say, silos. So you have, let's say, freight companies working with IT companies, or you might have, fossil fuel companies working with, communications companies, etc. So there's a lot of these unusual, let's say, marriages or partnerships that are starting to happen. And the key thing that I would say is that as part of our low carbon technology partnerships initiative, we've gone away from a position where we try and point the finger. So companies saying, look, governments, you're not doing your job right, we need the right regulations, and only if you put the right regulations in place, then we'll do something. And governments themselves looking at us and pointing at the finger saying, look, you're not doing enough. Instead, what we've realized is that there's really a need for collaboration and a strong and open dialogue. Because it's only by this dialogue that companies who've been trying to implement the technologies or solutions that are required for climate change can come to the policymaker and say, well, look, this is what we're up against. It's not just things like carbon pricing or fossil fuel subsidies, but it's also the details, and here's the list. And together, by also understanding what the different objectives are of the policymakers as well as the different sectors, we're able to identify, what are some of these new win-win solutions. And those win-win solutions are the ones that we will also be presenting in COP21. So I'd like to leave it at that for this point in time, and really look forward to the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much, Rasmus, and I particularly appreciate and support your point, obviously, about collaborative solutions, which I think have a key role to play. Now, as you will be able to see, we have worked through our technical issues, and we have the panel at the OECD back, so I'm going to hand back over to Simon to finish off his presentation.
Yes, hello, welcome back. I hope you can hear me well now. So we were interrupted just on the previous slide, and so I'll just finish the rest of the presentation. Quick recap: we were speaking about electricity market design when all of a sudden I froze, and we were speaking about the risks that current market design puts on low carbon generators. I don't know how much of the list I had gone through, so sorry if there's repetition, but there's certainly fossil fuel price and CO2 price risk. There's also a risk that during a transition phase, as we add more low carbon capacities that are required in terms of replacing old assets or meeting incremental electricity demand, that during such a transition phase we have very low market prices, which creates a bad climate for investment. And finally, if we do not increase the flexibility of power systems in line with growing shares of wind and solar capacities, the market value of wind and solar power on these short-term markets will suffer. All in all, these risks will mean less investments overall in low-carbon generation and higher risk premiums that drive up the prices for those investments that do happen. Now, just one illustration of how this risk may play out. So we see here, let's say we have one situation, a certain set of CO2 and fuel prices, and all of a sudden there's a surprise. Let's say government policies have changed and fossil fuels have gotten less expensive. So we see that the prices on the market drop, and ironically, it is the low carbon generators that are mostly exposed to this risk and have less revenue to cover the high investments that were made in order to build these assets. Next point, if we look at system flexibility, as you all know, the amount of wind and solar power in the system varies with the availability of the resource. Now, if we have a very rigid electricity demand, highlighted by the fact that demand is almost vertical, and we do not adapt the power plant fleet in the system, what happens when we increase the amount of wind and solar capacities is that their market value drops, making it more difficult for these technologies to recover their investment costs. Now, why does all this matter? If we look at the response of the cost of generating electricity with low carbon sources to risk, we find that the cost of financing actually has a very, very high impact on the overall cost of the delivered electricity. At a weighted average cost of capital of about 9%, we see that half of the LCOE of solar photovoltaics in this example is financing cost, and it just grows more and more as we go to higher costs of capital. So clearly this is a challenge to achieving the transition successfully. Now, to sum up, the big question that we're currently facing is how to organize competition to facilitate investments and have a cost-effective response to the many challenges in the system. How can we improve carbon pricing for electricity? How to best allocate some of the risks that I've just discussed? And how can we make sure that we have long-term credibility of price signals to keep financing costs low? More specifically on design of wholesale electricity markets, we see that liberalized markets and a CO2 price are necessary, but looking at the realities of markets today, they will be not sufficient to actually bring us to where we need to get in order to meet the 2-degree target. And there, of course, is the question how to change the out-of-market support that we're currently giving to low-carbon technologies towards a more integrated framework. As you see, we've raised a number of issues here. These are also the core topic of a publication that the IEA will publish earlier next year. It's called Repowering Markets. There you will find a more detailed discussion of these issues and also hinting to some of the solutions. And we'd also be very much happy to speak about this during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Hello, good, right. Thank you very much, Simon, for handling that in 2 halves. Right, now we are ready to go over to the Q&A, and some great questions that we've had come in from all sorts of places. Just to start with, I think a question, well, actually, the first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to apologize in advance if I pronounce anybody's names wrong. I will do my best, but there's a wide range of people and lots of questions, so I apologize if I get it wrong. It's not intentional. So to start with, I think there's been a couple of questions that I think is a good place to start, which is about the specific challenges for developing countries. So, you know, we've had the challenge back that this analysis feels like it's focused on the global north. Are there specific instances of misalignment or questions around how that would work in the global south, which came from Sheila Patrickson, and then Isaac Gray actually went further in terms of saying that he detected a lack of commitment to this kind of transition in developing countries and what needs to happen to change that. So there's a big open question over to the panel. See who wants to pick that up.
Yes, in fact, there are a range of examples that we drew from in the report that actually happening in developing countries. We identified, for instance, in the Fiscal Affairs Department, that, for instance, in China, the only way that local governments can make money and draw budget resources other than through central transfers is through the sale of land that is agricultural land that they then transform into urban land, which triggers urban sprawl because they have an incentive to an ever-growing quantity of land. So we provide examples along these lines. In some cases, we found examples of good solutions actually in developing countries as well. I think there are good market mechanisms in South Africa and in Brazil in particular when it comes to the penetration of renewables to give the right incentives for investment there. Maybe Simon wants to pick up on that. But yes, we did draw on a lot of examples from OECD, but we also tried to look at the reality of the situation, which is quite often different in some developing countries. I believe in urban mobility there are plenty of examples as well. Virginie may speak to that.
Yeah, maybe just to add on the point of frameworks for investments in low carbon electricity generation. On the one hand, we see a number of market arrangements that actually work quite effectively at giving long-term price signals to new capacities. So, for example, the system that is in place in Brazil is often cited as a good example for this. So, in general, the idea of auctioning for new capacities. However, there's other misalignments that do create problems where you have vertically integrated companies, monopoly structures. These are usually quite hostile to innovation, and often there is no way for new entrants to really get into the market. I think this is one of the big advantages of market liberalization in the electricity sector that we've had in OECD countries, that you actually do open the door for new entrants in the market. You have transparent procedures for accessing the grid and so forth, and where these such transparent procedures are not in place, we definitely have a clear case of a misalignment for fostering investments in low carbon capacities.
Rasmus, you you gave a good sense in terms of the complexity of implementation of a lot of these recommendations. Perhaps you could reflect on how that might change in the global north and the global south, or developing versus developed countries. I'll come back to you, Virginie, afterwards. Apologies for cutting across you.
Yeah. I might actually pick up where Simon left off. So we take a specific example. Let's take South Africa and Eskom, for example. It's a vertically integrated monopoly that has a history of underinvestment because it served essentially the minority white population, and today has to provide electricity and access to electricity to the full population, and that population, to a large extent, does not have the ability to pay. And so you're stuck with a situation really where a company isn't able to recover the costs and the investments that it needs to make through a tariff structure in the same way that you would have in the north. So in this situation, one of the things that we're working on is how can we complement that current local monopoly that essentially is a political tool in some ways rather than a commercial entity today. And the way that you can complement that is by supporting companies who want to build, for example, grid-scaled renewable generation that then gets bought through a power purchase agreement with Eskom. Or then the third option, of course, in terms of actually providing access to electricity is what we're working on, is trying to scale up the implementation of microgrids. We've seen a lot of great work that's been happening in terms of standalone solutions that have brought, things like mobile phone charging, lighting, etc., to households in remote communities. But can we scale that up a little bit further so that we can provide access to, even further development goals in terms of providing higher degrees of reliability as well as higher power to some of those communities, so that they can actually exercise some other, value-adding activities, have things like refrigeration as well as, schooling, internet, etc. And so we're trying to, really find those win-win situations. And the great thing that we're seeing, of course, is that there's a diffusion of technology. The great investments that have been made by countries like Germany as well as China have helped bring down the costs of a lot of these technologies so that they're available now in other situations where they might not have been previously.
Brilliant. So Virginie, obviously I want to direct the general question to you, but specifically on this question, on this topic of sort of developing versus developed, or the specific context in developing countries, your comments about insurance subsidies for agriculture, that prompted a few questions. So Will from the ADI challenge was curious as to the effect of removing that and its impact on smallholder farmers in developing countries. And Joanne Mander asked about how that would play into the international sphere, obviously with the big debate around loss and damage and looking at insurance mechanisms as a way of resolving some of the impacts in developing countries. So some thoughts around that would be really helpful as well.
Thank you very much, Elliot. On the specific question of agricultural subsidies and insurance subsidies for crops, we had actually in mind mainly examples from OECD countries. This is a practice that is well spread in the US, and that was kind of mainly the target and what I had in mind when I mentioned the need to remove those subsidies for insurance. It's really about reconnecting the farmers with the reality of climate change and with the risk of climate change. If I may just step out a little bit and take a broader picture on the debate between developed and developing, actually it's not a debate. What we're proposing is more a process that can apply to any types of countries, and we kind of fleshed this process with examples from OECD countries, from developing economies and from emerging economies. What is important to consider, and it echoes what Rasmus was saying, is that actually sometimes in developing countries it's where you have the higher risk of implementing the wrong policies today or financing the wrong infrastructure today that will lock them in a carbon-intensive future and facing the risk of stranding in the future. And there's as well the more maybe reward or benefits to get out of moving directly towards a low-carbon transition and green growth. But what is sure as well is that there's a lack of capacity and financial capacities and sometimes institutional capacities, and this will not happen without the help of countries such as most OECD countries in terms of financial support, technology transfer, we mentioned it, and consistency in official development assistance or other types of support.
So that's a perfect teeing up for a question that's just come in from Ruth Tiffer. What do you expect in the Paris conference? Where will the financial resources come from to reach the targets for carbon emissions reductions and the agenda of the Green Climate Fund? And I think in general there are a few questions about this from people like Augustine, who was worried about the international context, and Mukesh Kumar Gupta, who was looking at whether we've got enough drivers in the system to raise ambition to reach a 2-degree target in terms of stabilising global warming. So what do we think about the international context in terms of moving this agenda forward?
So if I may,
please.
One thing that, picking up, I think it was also one other person asked, what's stopping action? Are we only going to take action once really the risks become so severe or the impacts become so severe that we realize that we have to do something? I'd say that from the private sector perspective, and especially from the WBCSD's perspective, where we're working with large multinationals, but to a large extent, also much more progressive voices, we're starting to see that, in the dialogue that we hear from governments as well as all the different institutions and companies, that the low carbon future is inevitable. All the trends are pointing in that direction, all the regulation and policy. We'd like to, of course, to be moving faster, But that's essentially, the scenario which is most likely in terms of investment certainty at the moment. So that really puts us in a position where, the companies are starting to take action because they want to position themselves for success in that low carbon future. So it's not so much a question of, defensive action by a lot of the sectors who might, have high investments in fossil fuels, but it's rather looking to the future saying, okay, well, if that's the future, then what it's going to look like with the policies and regulations in place that promote low carbon solutions, how are we going to align our portfolio with that future so that we're successful? So we're really starting to see that kind of momentum where there's really a pull as well, and a great, tapping of innovation from the companies. But I'll maybe let the other panelists talk a little bit more about how the governments are dealing with this issue.
Rashad.
Yeah, Virginie will address the question of the 100 billions, if that's how I understood it. Now, we're generally happy with seeing the, a growing critical mass of contributions coming through the UNFCCC process, but what we are about here is to actually indicate to those same players that if they engage in the discussion inside their government, across the board, and not just those going to the COP, they will find more levers for action. And put differently, if they don't address those other parts of governments, I think they may find that the transition is going to be more difficult. We are now in a time and space where there's so much attention on climate that it is very important we grab this opportunity to raise the issue on the policy portfolio domestically so that those government administrations who think this is not my business will now take a closer look, identify the 3 or 4 large misalignments. I think Simon mentioned one on power generation, and others will find their own within their countries and decide to act resolutely on those, because that will unlock a lot of innovation and a lot of the movement that Rasmus is mentioning countries see coming. But if they don't address those, it will be a lot slower than anticipated, and that will be too bad and too costly. So we'll keep pushing with that message.
And just to finish regarding the commitment of the 100 billion and how to really leverage and get this money flowing, well, there are some initiatives that are currently underway to try to assess progress towards this 100 billion. It's very important. It's very important for the international negotiation in order to create trust and commitment and transparency, and to make sure that there's a good dialogue between developing and developed economies. But actually what this report is about the trillions that are needed. 100 billions are important, but it's just one step. And what is needed now is to help developing countries particularly, and our countries, to develop the appropriate framework that will mobilize the trillions beyond development assistance, beyond public financial institutions, and beyond those public actors that will play.
Great. Now, Simon, a lady called, somebody called Janadana Anjanappa, apologies if I've got that name wrong, had a very specific question about how you go about designing a renewable energy market, as I think they interpreted you saying. How does that compare in terms of detail with an approach where the driver is an ETS or a carbon tax? And how can that help set up short-term solutions for countries in the middle of a low-carbon transition?
Well, first of all, thanks for the question. It critically depends on at what phase of maturity a given country or region is in terms of the uptake of renewable energy. So if you imagine a country that is just now beginning to deploy renewable energy, for example, I've just recently been to Kazakhstan, there we have very low shares of renewables. The system is dominated by coal electricity, and all the regulatory structures, the contractual arrangements that are in place, a large number of overall system circumstances are really not designed in a way that it would facilitate the renewables uptake. So the first step to do is actually to streamline all these non-technical and essentially non-economic barriers in a way that uptake is possible. Then in the next step, to kickstart the market, we would say it does make sense to provide attractive returns for investors to shoulder the initial risk of picking up in a new market, because maybe there's weak infrastructure, some other barriers to overcome. But then as the market picks up momentum and grows to scale, it becomes increasingly important to add competitive pressure to get prices down, for example, by using auctions, and focusing on overall system aspects. So aligning general electricity policy and electricity markets with renewables with the objective to go towards a more integrated framework. I guess this is in a very general sense where we'd see how one would go about designing such a market. I hope that partially answers the question.
I hope so too. I think it sounds good to me. But a follow-up from David Fisher from the OECD, which is, what are the fundamental aspects in electricity market design where you've got high shares of renewables, say in a country like Germany, where you're really pushing the boundaries in terms of renewable share?
Yeah, so if you look at an electricity market towards decarbonization, the first thing to note is that there's a number of commonalities that actually wind and solar power share with other high capex, low carbon technologies. So the first part is to put a constraint on carbon, be it a tax, be it an ETS type system, be it just regulating capacities out of the market. The next part is to provide long-term, to ensure robust long-term price signals for capital-intensive investments. This can be if you have, for example, forward markets that are liquid, that are working well. It might work via bilateral agreements. Currently, that's not what we're seeing. So we need a supplementary mechanism to deal with that. Another factor to consider is, as I mentioned in my presentation, the transitional overcapacity. So when you're adding capacity quicker, that's exactly what we're seeing in Germany today and in a lot of Europe, is depressed market prices, because we're basically pushing additional electricity in a system that doesn't need it. And of course, you need to take a decision how to deal with that overcapacity and making sure that there are the right exit signals in place. And then finally, there's 2 points that are specific to wind and solar energy. One is balancing the system across a broad geographic area, and also coordinating a large number of resources. In the 1990s, Germany had about 1,000 centralized power generation facilities. You now have more than 2 million, I think, if I remember the number correctly, solar PV systems and tens of thousands of wind turbines. So that's really a different way of operating the system. And just to wrap up, you also need to incentivize flexible resources. So focus on demand-side response, focus on expanding the transmission grid, all of that issues that, for example, you do see in Germany on the agenda today.
Rasmus, did you have some thoughts on those questions?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that, if you're taking that question from the Global South perspective, that you really have the opportunity to learn from others. I mean, we saw, for example, when the UK redesigned their electricity markets, they looked to countries like Denmark to understand, what is the role of a flexible feed-in tariff, for example. So that really, I think that there's, a conversation that can happen between the different policymakers, and that's probably already happening. So I wouldn't worry too much about that side of things. And the other piece to remember is that, a big part of, the transition to new technologies like storage, like higher penetrations of renewables, means that there's a wholesale modernization of the grid, even in developed countries. And again, the Global South has the opportunity to learn from, for example, how to design evolutionary grid codes, or how to incorporate, higher degrees of distributed generation in their systems. So I think that it's a positive story that we've dealt with these questions in a lot of key markets already, and are starting to deal with some of the the newer issues, and we can certainly learn in the South as well from this.
Virginie, there was a question that came in from a lady called Hazel Henderson about a particular investment tracking system called the Green Transitions schedule, which is tracking over $6.2 trillion worth of investment on which is fairly, which has got some tight criteria in terms of what it's allowed to support. Do you see such tools as being useful? And what do you think? What role is there for? What kind of tools and trackers are needed to help encourage private sector investment to flow?
I'm afraid I don't know this tool, so I can't really talk about it. But what is sure is that we desperately need some strong data in order to understand where the money is flowing. Is it climate friendly? Is it not climate friendly? At the OECD, we have a research collaborative initiative that is putting together many organizations that are trying to develop some methodologies in terms of how can we assess private climate finance flows, and it's really not an easy task. task because you have, of course, the issue of definitions of what you can count as climate flows or not, and that is highly linked to political decisions. But we definitely need much more data, stronger data, and a regular tracking if we really want to assess progress of policies and progress towards our low carbon goals.
Great, thank you. And I think one last question that we'll go to, and then maybe we'll just go around the panel and just take any last thoughts that they want to leave us with. But a question that's actually come in twice, which is, I'll direct it at Richard, and the question is, would a stronger reliance on regulations, a firmer regulatory approach, lead to more stability and more confident investment in a low carbon economy?
Well, we are a little bit caught between two goals here. One is that we have to allow innovation, we have to allow new entrants, we have to allow new technologies, and to a large extent we think we know the answers to the low carbon transition. We think we know the picture by 2100. One thing we know for sure is that we're going to get that one wrong. So we want to have signals that go in the general direction, and at the same time, when required, when we want to promote some strong action rapidly and we know where this needs to happen, then regulation can come into play. I think Rasmus mentioned some of these. We have these policy interactions we have to manage, but I think in many cases it makes sense to have energy efficiency standards. It makes sense to drive innovation. Some of them are evolutionary, and so they cut it both ways, which is good. Having said that, we think it's also important to let a lot of innovators come in and feel, meet a niche at the outset to then grow and provide bigger solutions to this issue. So for that reason, we remain fairly certain that we need strong economic signals, and that's why we insist to start with carbon pricing. But I'd like to restate what we've been saying about the other policy environment, which is often has been regulated on a route which was using fossil fuels as the primary source of energy. And what we're saying is that we need to reconsider all these regulations to ensure that they're going to be providing the right signals for the low carbon transition. And that implies a change. So as far as this goes, yes, those regulations need to be looked at again, because they've been very effective in driving us towards high carbon, and now we want to go low. So that aspect has to be taken into account, and that's really the core of what we've been doing with this work.
Thank you, Richard. And maybe we can quickly go past the rest of the panel, Virginie, Simon, and Erasmus. Just one last thought you want to leave us with, one particular thing that excites you about this work.
Well, I can go first, maybe very briefly. If you look at the task at hand, you can think about this in terms of optimization versus transformation. And I think the change that is needed to the overall system is so large that we do need a transformative approach. Now short-term markets, as the one that I presented to you in electricity, they're very good at optimizing within the box of what is technologically currently possible. But I think actually pushing the boundary, I mean, despite some examples that are frequently cited, such as smartphones and all that, where the private sector does innovate, I'm not debating that, but when we're talking about transformative change to the very foundations of our economy, I think that is something where governments do have a strong role to play.
Yes, just maybe one message. If some government representatives are in the webinar today are listening to us, I think really take this work forward and take this home and apply this process and this methodology to your own domestic context, because it's not about adding more difficulties to a low carbon pathway. It's actually helping you identify more leverage and more levers to go towards the road of a low carbon economy at the lowest cost and with the best synergies with other policy options that you may have.
Rasmus.
Yeah, so I'd actually add just two things. So the point about this isn't necessarily about having more regulation, and I think our panelists made the very good point that it's also about removing some regulations, right, that are harmful. And then I'd really like to echo Simon's point about transformation. I mean, this is a transformation, and I think simply the fact that this work has been done already sends a signal to the private sector and other economic actors out there that it's really a policy direction that needs to be followed. and therefore that investments as well need to follow this direction. If we're not just talking about the core actors like the ministries of energy or environments, but everybody else being involved, this really sends the right signal in terms of which way we're heading, and therefore the ways that the companies themselves need to change.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you to a great panel and a great discussion. I really enjoyed that. I hope everybody else did as well. I urge everybody to read the report if you haven't already, because from what I've managed to read, it looks really good and a really useful resource going forward. Just to remind everyone, this has been recorded, so if there were some great moments that you want to relive again and again and again, you can do. If you go to www.greengrowthknowledge.org. And I'm sure the Green Growth Knowledge Platform will be interested in any questions, and certainly will be very interested in your response to the survey that you will get after this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.